Thank you for all
Good.
How are
Thank
you,
you.
Professor?
Thank you for inviting me.
It's an honor. Thank you for being here.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I see your names quickly popping into the chat as attendees. So while we wait for the lecture to start, I'm going to be promoting all attendees to panelists so that you can turn your cameras on and join us in this conversation during the Q&A portion. Please accept my invite. If somehow I miss you, just raise your virtual hand and I'll go back and promote you to panelist again. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and good evening. If you can work with Daphne and turn on your cameras, that would be great, so we can kind of get a sense of a virtual community. And we'll start in a moment.
I was contemplating not turning on my camera because I'm not that pretty.
Okay, so I think we're just going to start, and I just wanted to say, so I'm Charles Small. I'm the director of ISGAP, and I want to thank our team, our staff, El Shaddai, Daphne, and Martha for getting the logistics of this program together. And I would like to thank very much Mahek for all of her work putting the seminar series together on a very important subject matter. And Professor Michael Berenbaum, thanks for being here as our first speaker. And, these are very auspicious times, very important times for the future of the Jewish people. And I think that the conversations in our community these days are often evoking the Holocaust. There was a pogrom in southern Israel that was the largest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. So these issues are raw, and tragically, they're not just placed in the departments of history around the world, but these ideas are tragically alive and well. And Professor Berenbaum is speaking about Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel was our first president of ISGAP, and I really had the honor and privilege of knowing him. He had a sister in Montreal, and we would see him regularly in Montreal. And Elie Wiesel always taught that the Holocaust did not begin with the railroad tracks and the crematoriums, but they began with words and ideas. And pathetically, the words and ideas that led directly to the Holocaust, the protocols of the elders of Zion, and all the lies are alive and well in the Muslim Brotherhood, in Hamas, in Hezbollah, in the Iranian revolutionary regime. And I can't believe I'm saying this to you in 2023. They're alive and well, not just on the campuses in the United States of America and Canada and the United Kingdom and France and Italy and beyond. They are alive and well in the classrooms of some of the most prestigious universities in the Western world. And this is our new old reality. So on this note, I wish you well in the seminar series, and these are very important subject matter. And I hope we have a productive seminar series. So again, Mahak, thank you so much. And Michael, thank you. And the floor is yours, Mahak. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon the time zones where you're joining us from. Welcome, everybody, to the ISGAP Holocaust and Literature Seminar Series. With the receding number of Holocaust survivors, it becomes pertinent to devise different approaches through which Holocaust can be taught. Teaching the Holocaust through literature is a unique approach to educating students about the horrors of the Holocaust, using literature as a tool to help them understand the gravitas of what took place. Literature is known for its power to transport readers into different worlds, to make them feel emotions they might not otherwise feel, and to challenge their understanding of history. By using literature to teach about the Holocaust, educators are able to add depth and context to what the students are learning. They can create a more engaging and impactful learning experience for students. This approach can thus help students to develop critical thinking skills, empathy, and a more sensitive understanding of history. As using literature to teach the Holocaust can be challenging, it therefore becomes important for the educators to provide support and guidance while students are reading and interpreting these works in order to encourage students to reflect on their questions and thoughts and in turn foster empathy. And this is precisely the purpose of our Holocaust and Literature seminar series. It features a varied list of world-renowned Holocaust scholars, professors, and educators who will walk us through the different approaches of literature by which the subject of Holocaust can be taught. And to begin our lecture series, we have with us someone who doesn't need any introduction, Professor Michael Berenbaum. Professor Michael is the director of the Sigi Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University. He was also the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He was the project director overseeing the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of its research institute, and later served as the president and CEO of the survivors of the Shoah Virtual History Foundation, which took the testimony of 52,000 Holocaust survivors in 32 languages and 57 countries. His work in film has won Emmy Awards and Academy Awards. Professor Berenbaum is the author and editor of 18 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds of journalistic pieces. He won the Simon Rockover Memorial Award for the American Jewish Press Association 3 times in 3 different categories during a 2-year period. He is also the executive editor of the new Encyclopedia Judaica, the 22-volume, 16 million words second edition, transformed and now improved the classic 1972 work. He was also awarded the Dartmouth Medal by the American Library Association for the outstanding reference work of 2006. Welcome, Professor. We are truly honored to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to participate in the seminar. I would also say that it's a pleasure for a moment to focus on something other than what we're experiencing at this moment. And if this is a diversion, it's an important diversion. I've been given a brief time and I want to cover an awful lot of material. I want to deal with the early works of Elie Wiesel, and I think in many respects, the early works of Elie Wiesel were not only formative for him, but they were transformative in terms of our understanding of the life of the survivor and the post-life of the post-Holocaust journey that many survivors took. I'm going to focus on the issue of God and humanity, in Wiesel's terms, God and man in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And I want us to consider an important interpretation. I'm presuming that virtually everybody here has read Night, if not once, then multiple times. And I want everybody to consider an article many years ago by Lawrence Cunningham, who spoke of night as the anti-Exodus. The classical Jewish story is the journey from slavery onto freedom. And what we did was to take a very particular story, and everybody understands the nature and the implications of that story. It's the story of everybody has a Pharaoh and everybody has a slavery, and everybody has to journey out into the desert. There must be a sea to cross, a desert to traverse. And finally, there's the question of where does one go and how does one enter the promised land? The narrative of the Holocaust begins in Wiesel's night as precisely the opposite. It's the journey to a world infused by God. At the beginning of night, he's asked by Moshe, "Why do you pray?" He says, "Why do I pray?" A strange question. Why do I breathe? Why do I live? Into a journey into servitude and into what we might call the revelation of the anti-God and the anti-man at Auschwitz. So it's precisely the anti-Exodus and the theme of the anti-Exodus that appears, and we have to stress this because, as Charles knows from his own contact with Elie Wiesel, there was one thing that could infuriate Elie Wiesel, and that is if anybody called Night a novel instead of calling Night a memoir. That's the moment at which he consistently and constantly lost his temper, because he insisted that it was a memoir, but the memoir is built on a motif, and the motif is what I would suggest the anti-Exodus to the anti-revelation. That is the revelation of the dark side of humanity, and also to the question of where was God. The culmination of that is for a man who, in his own words, for a boy who began to see no difference between prayer and breathing, was his experience being a stranger, as it were, at the Yom Kippur services, at the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services, and the like. And Wiesel leaves that with a whole range of questions. And the question becomes essentially, how do we come to terms with God? And how does one deal with the shattering of God in terms of what the experience? The culmination, he describes the hanging of 3 prisoners, an act of resistance, for acts of resistance, among them brave young child, too light to die and too brave to tell what he knows. As he passes the 3 hanging, the prisoner is asked, "Where is God now?" And he hears the inner voice answering, "He is here on the gallows." And in a very real sense, we understand its relationship to the crucifixion story. We also understand that death did not offer salvation and did not offer a promise of atonement. So he depicts the anti-God. He also depicts the moment at which he eats on Yom Kippur. And he says an interesting thing: I accede to my father's request. I nibbled the crust of bread, and in the depth of my being, I felt a great void. For my mind, this becomes absence. A void is absence where presence had been, and absence where presence has been. The rest of Wiesel's overture, especially in his early works, was a question: how do you deal with that absence, and how do you come forth with it? Wiesel's Night appears as part of a trilogy, and the trilogy was Night, Dawn, and in its initial publication, The Accident. But in its latter publication, he returned to its original title, in French, Le Jour, the Day, and deals with the question of the transition from night to dawn and day. And the novel Dawn and Dawn is a novel. It is not biographical. It is Wiesel, as it were, trying out one thing that could have happened at that point in his life, but a direction that he chose not to take. As he was a young student in Paris, he did not go to Israel to live, did not go to Palestine to live, and to Israel to live, but he continued in France and ultimately to the United States. And the dilemma that's posed to the character is the dilemma of executing the British prisoner, who is the British soldier, who is to be taken prisoner for the Jewish soldier, for a young Jewish soldier. And we have to focus on a couple things in the novel that become very important. The first thing that he focuses on in the novel, it's set in Palestine just prior to the establishment of Israel. Elisha is its central character, and Elisha is a very important name, and we'll come to that in a moment. Elisha is a concentration camp survivor who goes from a student in Paris to become a trained terrorist who must execute a British soldier, John Dawson, in retaliation for the execution of a young Jewish fighter. And Wiesel writes, in doing so, in his own words, he takes upon himself the function of God. And if in order to change the course of history, we have to play God, we have to become God, we shall become him. In that sense, he's mirroring a whole range of movements in Jewish history, which is to say we cannot wait for God to transform history. We must take that responsibility onto ourselves. In playing the role of God, even to change the Jewish future, man destroys God, and that's the price for that future, a price willingly, albeit so painfully, paid by Elisha. He and his comrades, who are native Palestinians, do not face the same demons, nor do they see history through the same complex. Let's deal with the name Elisha. And Elisha has four different names, four different meanings to the same name. Elisha's a name laden with meaning. Elisha is a biblical prophet, a disciple of Elijah, who performs twice as many miracles as Elijah, including reviving the dead, crossing the sea, healing the leper. And one has to think of Elisha as, again, the journey of the Jewish people to revive itself from dead, to cross the sea, and to heal its leprous status. The second Elisha is Elisha ben Abuya, a second century rabbinic figure of much controversy and more intrigue. He was a teacher of Rabbi Meir, a teacher who lost his faith and declared that the world was let din v'let dayan, the world was without a judge and without justice. Since one of the themes of in Dawn is the Jew becoming judge and achieving justice, the name Elisha has a historical resonance. The word Elisha comes from the root Elisha, God who saves. Elisha, and understanding the word is essential to the novel, most especially in its surprising conclusion. After Elisha executes the soldier, he realizes, that's it, it's done. I've killed Elisha. On a literal level, Elisha has killed part of himself. However, Wiesel implies a greater death through his choice of the name. Elisha, the Hebrew translation, which means God will save. Which Elisha was killed? What was its implication? Was it Elisha who revives the dead, who crosses the sea, who heals the leper? Was that the Elisha who was killed? Was it Elisha ben Abuya who says the world is without a judge and without justice, and now we shall be the judge and we shall achieve justice? And if that resonates a little bit with echoes some of the dilemmas that we see happening today, so be it. Is it Elisha, who's the God who saves, which says we can't wait for God to save, we have to deal with the world in which we live, and that's a world which cannot wait for such a divine? Or was it Elisha, the character itself? Wiesel grapples in this novel with the promise of Israel without rejecting the urgency or the importance of establishing the state and securing the Jewish future. He demonstrates, ironically, its inadequacy as an answer to the past. It too must be a question that we ask of the Jewish people. Some have described two paths survivors could find to the future. One was national in rebuilding the state of Israel. The other was personal in rebuilding their shattered lives and the movement to embrace and celebrate life. Wiesel demonstrates that such a reading of return is inadequate. Such a reading is incomplete and rather simplistic. When Elisha said, "I've killed Elisha," the statement must be read on 4 levels. Something of the self died the moment he became a killer. We must ask, is Elisha the prophet killed because healing occurs at the expense of another? It's not a miracle, it's a struggle. Is Elisha ben Abiah killed because we now have the Jews are the judges bent on achieving justice, even if the English are to be killed rather than Nazis because the Jews need a home for the future? Is Elisha the God who saves killed? Is the Jewish entry into Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish state a revolution in Jewish history? Because it is not God who saves, but the people who save themselves. Unwilling to wait, the Jews have re-entered history and assumed power, a stance very different from those who believe that the task of redemption, of restoration to the land of Israel, was God's alone. These are the questions raised by Dawn, and they're the questions that Wiesel poses in a very real way rather than answers, but a very important question indeed. The third book that in the trilogy, and notice something very interesting, that God is enormously present at the beginning. He is shattered with dawn, and now in day we find something very interesting, that God is absent. In day, Wiesel finds a new and painful way of speaking of God in the post-Holocaust world. He develops a language that gives voice to his anger, but one that cannot yet touch his anguish. He has a character in there who is the doctor, who the setting for the scene is something that actually happened to Wiesel. Wiesel was run over by a cab driver on his way to a film, and he sat and struggled for many months between life and death. And part of what he had was a doctor who came in to heal him. The doctor is real. The depiction of the character and the dialogue in this novel is very different. The doctor regards death as an enemy. Like the survivor, the American doctor is intimate with death, but certain of his opposition to death and the need to do battle. Eliezer, who's the character, the protagonist in the novel, recounts the 2 times he underwent anesthesia and dreamed, once as a child when he saw God, and now after the accident when God was absent. Wiesel's trilogy begins with a God-infused world, ends with a universe in which God is absent, the titles becoming brighter as God's presence is diminished. And in both dawn and day, Wiesel struggles with the image of how to speak with God, how to speak of God in a post-Holocaust world. And this is early in his career when he's wrestling with God. The second character in Day is a Hungarian fellow survivor whose name is Gula. And Gula is redemption in Hebrew, a painter whose response to near death was the celebration of freedom. He proceeds to paint Eliezer's picture, and upon its completion, to burn it with those fires, and with those fires, he burns the past. Yet as the novel concludes, the ashes remain. The survivor is alive, so it's unclear as to why. In Day, the brightness of the tile belies the harshness of the divine image. And Wiesel here is, in many respects, at his fiercest. Man prefers to blame himself for all possible sins and crimes, rather than come to the conclusion that God is capable of the most flagrant injustice. I still blush every time I think of the way that God makes fun of human beings, his favorite toys. God is depicted as dependent on the human being for entertainment and diversion. That's what the philosophers and the poets, Wiesel writes, refused to admit. In the beginning, there was neither the word nor love, but laughter, the roaring eternal laughter, whose echoes are more deceitful than the mirages of the desert. Twice, Wiesel focuses on the relationship of suffering and saintliness, and some even regarded Wiesel as a saint, as a secular saint. Eliezer rejects Kathleen, calling him a saint so violently that he has sexual relationship with her so much as without a kiss. Such is not the behavior of a holy man. And yet when Eliezer meets a 16-year-old Sarah who's been used as a prostitute by the Nazis, he concludes a demonic manifestation of God against his own will and calls her a saint. Wiesel understands that suffering pushes toward intimacy. He rejects that it leads toward saintliness, a view shared by Primo Levi. His critique of Christianity is explicit. He writes, in the beginning was neither love nor the word, but laughter. He's no less harsh of his critique of the Jewish conception of God, at least not in name. The Torah says that no man can see God and live. For Wiesel understanding, such a living God deprives one of the desire to live. The anger of the survivor is acute. The commitment of life is tentative and indifferent. Life or death, it didn't matter. These questions are not resolved in Wiesel's trilogy. They do form the core of the questions of his next work, The Town Beyond the Wall. At the end of the day, Eliezer is alive, but there's no resolution, no redemption from the past. In confrontation with the suffering of another and the wisdom of existentialism, a way is found to live in the word of absurdity. In The Town Beyond the Wall, Wiesel wrestles with the possibility of the meaning of suffering, both at the beginning and the end of the novel. The book centers on a character, Mikael, who is like God, a concentration camp survivor who secretly and illegally returns to the place of his birth to confront the townspeople who have been indifferent to his fate. Michael's key relationship is with Pedro, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, who has his own story of horror. His fiancée was murdered and then raped, violated by Franco's forces. Pedro represents Albert Camus and existentialism, a different way of confronting evil and finding a way to live in the world of suffering. Wiesel states without qualification that a search for meaning in the Holocaust is in vain. In his essay, he writes, the Holocaust defies meaning. It marks the defeat of the intellect who wants to capture meaning with a capital M in history. So the book is a struggle to live with tentative meanings, with questions, not with answers. Recall the teaching of Moshe the Beetle the Night. Captured by the communists, Michael learns to endure torture, at least until Pedro can escape back over the border. Suffering in this context makes sense. It is for a purpose. Though anguish and torturous, it is redemptive, offering Pedro and the opportunity to live. The key to Wiesel's understanding of suffering is presented in dialogue with Pedro, who says to Michael, you frighten me, you want to eliminate suffering by pushing it to the extreme, to madness. To say, I suffer, therefore I am, is to become an enemy of man. What you must say is, I suffer and therefore you are. Camus wrote somewhere that to protest against the universe of unhappiness, you have to create happiness. That's the arrow pointing the way it leads to another human being, and not via absurdity. The setting for these words in the novel marked them as a revelation to Michael. The Jew wanted to eradicate evil and to create that which would endure for eternity. The Jew had much to learn from the Spaniard. Tentative truths also are represented in Pedro's response to death. Man must not have the last word, but the last cry. That moment marks the birth of art. For Pedro, life is a duel between man and God. Man seeks to create and build, and God reminds all creation of its finitude. Pedro sees that art may endure, but only as a challenge to the question in the face of the all-consuming absurdity. And Michael finally applies the lessons that Pedro taught him in prison. In the process, he discovers the possibility of finding meaning in living for another, in helping another. His soliloquy with Menachem, and Menachem means he who consoles, his young cellmate, is a lesson in living with tentative truths. It is a discovery that the memory of suffering can be used to heal and to reach out to someone. And Wiesel shows that suffering need not tear us apart, but can bring us together, discovering our common humanity and our common fragility. And I want to suggest to you that becomes the turning point in Wiesel's career. It becomes the way in which he addresses and deals with and wrestles with and struggles with his own suffering through the rest of his life, most especially in what this marks the transition almost between Wiesel, whose major impact is in writing, and Wiesel's whose later impact is primarily as a public figure who also writes, rather than a writer who inadvertently became the public figure. Let's take it because our time is brief. That gives me my 20 or 25 minutes, Dr. Berza. And let's take questions, comments, responses. And as we say, there are no bad questions. I can only give inadequate answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. That was truly insightful. And for the audience, you can raise your virtual hand to ask questions or type your questions in the chat, and I'll address them. And before we get to it, Professor, I have a question. Elie Wiesel, I want to draw your attention to sometimes that is referred to as a paradox, the term Holocaust literature. And in Dimensions of Holocaust lectures at Northwestern University, so Elie Wiesel states, there is no such thing as the literature of the Holocaust. A novel about Treblinka is either not a novel or not about Treblinka. So how do we address that paradox?
You know, there's also the famous statement, there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. Yes. But the reality is that human beings tell stories and write. And I found in working with Wiesel on the museum that he had a problem that could not lead to the building of a museum. On a very deep level, he felt the story could not be told. He said again and again, only those who were there will ever know, and those who were there can never tell. And when we built the museum and tried to do that, we had to understand the first part of his statement. In Talmud speak, that's the Resha, and we had to reject the second part of his statement. Only those who were there will ever know. We could respect the unique perspective of the survivor, but we can't say that those who were there can never tell. For him, the Holocaust became, as it were, the mysterium tremendum, that which we could not speak, almost like God, which you could only approach via negativa and via positiva. You can only say what God is not and what God aspires to be, but you cannot describe and confront and understand God. And we had to take something else, which is we had to say the story of the Holocaust can be told. And we use the words of survivors and the experience of survivors again and again to tell that story. So as Wiesel did that, he also rejected doing that. He said, I only wrote about the Holocaust once, and then he continued and was regarded as what? As the major voice of Holocaust survivors. And speaking of that experience, approaching it, touching it, not quite being there. But if we had followed Wiesel, there would be nothing that we could do with regard to the Holocaust. And we have to understand Wiesel, in one sense, is saying a little bit of modesty, which is you can't really fully, completely, and totally understand it, but it takes audacity to confront this event, and it takes audacity to create as you confront in this event. And we have seen manifestations of it in what? In art, in music, even in dance, in museums, in film, in literature. And consequently, we can't reject them all as inadequate. So with all due respect, we have to suggest that Wiesel is setting an impossible standard that he himself continually violated.
That kind of reminds me about what Primo Levi said, that the real witnesses are those who died.
And there's we're going to call you on you, Steve, in one moment. There's an interesting thing. David Broder wrote a book in 1946. He was a psychologist who interviewed survivors. And the title of his book is I Did Not Interview the Dead. It's the earliest series of interviews. And I did not interview the dead. And he was Chicago-based and at the Chicago Institute of Technology. And he went over because he thought that they had a story to tell. And I'm also minded of a peculiar thing. Yesterday's Torah, today's Monday, I'm sorry. So Saturday's Torah portion tells the classical story of Lot's wife, who turns around and looks back at Sodom and turns into a pillar of salt. And I never understood that story as a young student of Torah. And when I read that story in the aftermath of the Shoah, it says, if you turn around too soon, you're paralyzed by grief. You have to get on with the difficult business of recreating life. Steve, you were about to ask a question. Let me call on you.
Yes, my question relates actually to Dr. Burza's introductory comments about the role of literature to teach and understand history. And I mean, the implication is that teaching and understanding history can ultimately alter future history as a result of that experience, the exposure to events of the past. Now, the reality is that those of us here in this Zoom session are from a generation that used to read history, and our information came with effort. The sad reality is that the generation of today is getting its information not from literature, is getting its information from influencers. And so the question is, these sessions such as this is critical, of course, but if it is intended to further the purpose of information and possibly affect the course of history, the medium has changed. An example is this. I'm a part of an organization, Physicians, Doctors Against Racism and Anti-Semitism. And what we managed to do in the University of Toronto and several other universities in Canada is to introduce about 3 hours of education on the role of medicine in the Holocaust to medical students. The information has to be brought to people who are there because they will no longer seek it by reading Night or Day or Dawn. So this is such a treasure of knowledge and information that we get. But how do we make it accessible and directed to people that are the future?
Let me respond in a couple of ways. I paid a visit with Lawrence Langer last week. Larry is now in his 11th decade. He's still writing, still publishing. He's been seriously ill. And we spoke at some length of his career, and he said something very interesting. He said, I read history, and I've been trying to convince historians that they have to read literature. Sometimes literature, even fiction, reveals a deep and a profound truth. And sometimes in a complex world, the deepest truths that we find in that complexity is in literature. You're pointing to a major, major issue, which we have a generation that does not read. And we also no longer have a great tradition of literary competence that should be understood. So part of what we do is to find all sorts of means of education. That's one of the reasons that we experiment in a variety of presentations. It's one of the reasons that we convinced, and we're going to be in Toronto in about 1.5 years with an exhibition, Auschwitz not long ago, not far away. The title of it is deeply offensive because it would be our greatest desire that Auschwitz be long ago, far away, ancient history, irrelevant to the common humanity that we share in our wonderful world. But this is an exhibition because Auschwitz was convinced of 700 artifacts from the museum at Auschwitz. Auschwitz was convinced not only do we have to bring people to Auschwitz, but we have to bring Auschwitz to the people. We can not only be receptors, we have to reach out. Museums have been created in many places in the world. Films are being developed. Literature is being written. There are also new experiments in virtual reality. And there certainly will be experiments as we go forth in with AI as to how to progress, how to deal and how to share the Holocaust. And part of that reason is because the Holocaust is one of the transformative events that shatters our notion of acceptable dimensions of history, revealing capacities of humanity that we did not understand. And the killers, and I'm always mindful of Robert J. Lifton's comments there. You know the book Nazi Doctors. Robert J. Lifton has a comment as he was going out to interview doctors. He had a conversation with a survivor. Turned out that survivor was Elie Wiesel. And Wiesel asked him, "Tell me, Bob, were these people human, or were they demonic when they did what they did?" And Robert J. Lifton answered him, "They were human, and worse yet, they were doctors, which is the reason that I am interviewing them." And at that point, Wiesel commented in his own particular way, "It's demonic that they were not demonic." We who study this event have to understand the people who perpetrated the event and not only the people who experienced the suffering. We have to understand their motivation and the like, but we have to present this material in all of the forms that will reach the younger generation. And we also have to present it to an audience that now has limited attention spans as a consequence of the people who see the world through their telephones and see the world in 30-second bites and in 150 character tweets, et cetera, et cetera. So you're pointing to a dimension. I also want to say something else, which has had a tremendous impact on me. I refereed a dissertation, which the student made a point that was worthy of full and complete and further examination. He said, the irony is that in societies where history cannot be trusted, literature becomes the greatest conveyor of truth. He was writing about Russian literature. And he was writing about why are the literary figures in Russia, pre-Soviet, Soviet, and post-Soviet, why are they the major figures of society? Because where history has been corrupted and tainted and shattered, literature means fiction. If it's told wisely enough and deceptively enough to get through the censors, literature becomes the only conveyor of truth.
Thank you, Professor. We do have a couple of questions. The first is there an understanding today of the term common humanity? And if yes, what are its key pillars?
Is there an understanding of common humanity? It depends whom you ask and with whom you speak. And frankly, in our world, there is no collective understanding of common humanity because we have multiple perspectives that are being offered that clash with one another.
All right.
Have I gone off because all of a sudden my screen's become blank?
No, Professor, we can hear you properly. You're audible.
Okay, I'm now operating in the dark, so you're going to have to referee this. I don't know what happened to my screen, but as long as you can see me, we can continue.
Oh, we can see you and hear you properly, Professor. So the next question is regarding the current situation. And he says, stepping current with 1,400 civilian Jews slaughtered, etc. So how can we get the media to tell the truth and not visit these war crimes on Israel instead? And then there is a second part to this question, how to keep Biden and Trudeau from frustrating Israel's destruction of Hamas so that Hamas can regroup and do it again?
Okay, let me begin that we have a, look, there's a structure, there's a problem with the media, and there's a problem with what we experience. Problem with the media is that the media has now gotten into the habit of saying there's one perspective and another perspective, and somehow we find the truth on somewhere in between. I want to take one very specific example. There was a discussion last week on Andrea Mitchell's show, and Andrea Mitchell is a seasoned and veteran reporter about the issues surrounding the bombing of the hospital in Gaza. Now, the most intriguing thing about that is there was no bombing of the hospital. It was a bombing. There was no hospital involved in the bombing. It was the parking lot adjacent to the hospital, and there was no bombing. And the bombing was not, there was an explosion of a missile on the parking lot adjacent to the hospital. And yet a week later, after you had all of the descriptions coming in, after the major newspapers and the major media outlets in a very real way disproved the original claim, and after even the original claim of 500 deaths was not a verifiable claim, and one of the physicians involved said, well, it could have been 5,000 people who were killed at that point. There was a repetition of the hospital that was bombed with 500 casualties, and that becomes again part of the confusion, what you could say, the fog of war, and the irresponsibility of the media in promulgating that. The media developed a certain responsibility with fact checks, and it's not developing that there. And you also have, Israel has a particular problem because it tries to confirm the information, and that takes time. And we live in the immediacy that takes place. Let me suggest a paradox. The paradox is that Israel's strength is its weakness, and its weakness is its strength. What do I mean by its strength is its weakness? The idea that Israel is strong and the Palestinians are weak. People root for the underdog and see what strength as a weakness, and believe that justice must be with the oppressed. The other half of that is that Israel's strength is its weakness. Israel is concerned about the operations taking place with hostages present. and Israel is concerned about the scale and scope of civilian casualties in a way that its enemy is not, because Hamas has situated its infrastructure amidst the civilian population, not to protect the civilian population. So that becomes deeply and profoundly problematic. But we're living at a turning point in contemporary understanding of Jews and their situation. And that is that pogroms were supposed to be something of the past, and what we experienced on October 7th is not the Holocaust, but a pogrom, and a pogrom that was uniquely and singularly effective, one that towers over in its manifestation, towers over the famed pogrom of Kishinev, and even the pogrom of November 1938, commonly known as Kristallnacht. Jews were not supposed to be vulnerable under Zionism, but protected under Zionism. And Israel failed in its most basic responsibility, which was to protect its citizens. And we are experiencing a dramatic resurgence of the expression of anti-Semitism in a context, by the way, in which all hatreds are being expressed. And we're seeing it at the elite institutions of the world, at Harvard, at Cornell, at the University of Pennsylvania. And that again challenges the notion of the great achievement of what we thought was the great achievement of contemporary Jews, which was the shattering of the glass ceiling and their acceptance and their safety in liberal democracies such as the United States and Canada. I think President Biden's behavior has been extraordinary, and I think that one has to look at the manifestations of American power in the region to fully understand the way in which the United States has behaved. In that sense, we Jews cannot feel alone in the way we have felt alone in previous times. Let me turn it back to you. Again, I'm blind, which means that you have to interrupt me.
No problem, Professor. Professor William has a question. Please feel free, Professor William, to unmute yourself and ask the question.
I'm unmuted. Hi, Michael. It's nice to get the chance to meet you, and thank you for the really brilliant talk. I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about a kind of paradox that you bring up in relationship to Wiesel's wife. It's late here. I'm in Jerusalem, so slips of the tongue will happen. So on the one hand, you said that, as we know, that you can't make meaning out of the Holocaust, but in a way, Wiesel is probably the person most responsible for turning what he did, that is the activity of memory and testimony, turning that itself into the meaning. Do you have any comments on that or thoughts about that?
Look, I really believe that Wiesel believed, and I wrote this many years ago in my first book, in fact, in my PhD dissertation, that Wiesel felt that the Holocaust was the ineffable, that it was comparable in that sense to Sinai, to the revelation, but this time it's the revelation of the anti-God, the anti-man. And I believe that he got caught up in a philosophical problem. If you can't speak about it, you can't say it, then let's not go near it, but you must go near it, you must draw near it, you must come close to it, you must express it. And it's clear that his life gave meaning to the Holocaust. And if you ask me what his life did in a very real sense, and it showed us the way, because he essentially tried to do with the Holocaust, whether knowingly, unknowingly, intuitively, or because of his deep emergence in Jewish life, he tried to do to the Holocaust what the ancient Israelites did to the story of the Exodus, a particular story that retained its particularity but became universal, and that then was used to teach fundamental ethics about human responsibility, the expansion of human responsibility that reached out to other people in suffering and in pain, and that called forth a demand of ethics and a demand of commitment, and gave an ethical meaning, an ethical imperative to the Holocaust, which for many of us gave it a sense of meaning, even as meaning, and let's take his words, with a capital M, could not take place. Now, some say that the meaning of the Holocaust can be found in the state of Israel, and Wiesel was careful about not allowing that, because he said no Jewish leader in 1933 presented this statement, in 15 years you will have a Jewish state, but this will be its cost. No Jewish leader would have opted for that. No Jewish leader could have chosen that. And yet, in a very real and very important sense, that's what people who say that Israel is the answer to the Holocaust sometimes imply. I think Israel is the question we ask of the Jewish future, and that doesn't diminish its importance. It perhaps intensifies it.
Yes, please go ahead, Murray, to ask a question. Please unmute yourself and ask your question, Murray Rubin.
Who?
It's Murray, he's raising up his hand, but he needs to be unmuted.
Murray.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. I want to point out that everything that happens to people does not happen in a vacuum. There are usually logical reasons for it. And I want to mention the first logical reason, what's going on at the university campuses in North America. There's a reason that it's there. And the reason is that there are many more Muslim students in the universities now than Jewish students. And they go out of their way to tell their story. The Jewish story is not of interest to them. It doesn't mean that the universities are completely anti-Semitic. I want to point out that most people in the world are not anti-Semitic, and thank God for that. They are indifferent. They are indifferent because all people are indifferent. And I want to point out that Jews can be indifferent too. There are many murders going on today in the world that the Jewish community doesn't worry about because it doesn't involve Jewish people. And before I end, I want to tell you that I think very, very carefully about what the IDF is doing with the bombings in Gaza. I think there was two big mistakes in Israel. The first mistake was leaving Gaza and thinking that the Gazans would elect somebody who would want to make peace with Israel. That was wishful thinking to the highest point. The Jews should have, and they didn't, because they didn't want the trouble. They didn't want the trouble. Now, we have a situation where if the IDF hadn't won their war in 48, we wouldn't be sitting here talking. We were lucky that we won it. And I want to leave with the idea, after anti-Semitism has sprouted up all over the world again, that the Jews in the diaspora need Israel as much as the Jews in Israel need Israel. That is not a fact that is realized by a lot of people. And I'm going to end up with something. The Jews of the diaspora sent a lot of money to the Middle East to support the Jews in the Middle East. Now, this may be complete wishful thinking on my part, that the Jews have to send money. I see Miss Berza shaking her head. The Jews have to send money to help.
If we could just keep it brief.
I'm finished. The Jews have to send money to help build a Palestinian state, because the Arab nations won't do it. And that is a fact
Let me,
can't ignore.
let me step in only because the time is getting short and it's important that we deal with it. Number one, there are not many more Muslim students than there are Jewish students on the college campuses. University of Pennsylvania, for example, is 16% Jewish, down ironically from 33% Jewish, but 16% Jewish, and there are not 16% Muslims at the University of Pennsylvania. Harvard has many more Jewish and Israeli students than it does, and by the way, Jewish and Israeli faculty than it does have Muslim faculty. That's not the issue, is not a numerical issue. And we Jews have been unbelievably successful storytellers. I went to a conference of Variety magazine, which is a Hollywood magazine of anti-Semitism, convened by Variety in Hollywood to deal with it. And in the room were some of the greatest storytellers of this generation, people who are household names as storytellers. We have a story to tell, and we now have to understand the degree to which we must tell that story effectively and efficiently. We are all troubled by the bombings in Gaza, because the reality is that that is the cost of war. Part of that is attributed to the fact that Hamas has embedded itself within the civilian population, not giving a care about the civilian population, and assuming also that, assuming in a very deep and very profound way that if Israel attacks the civilian population of Gaza, that will be the weakening of Israel and of support for Israel in the West. The decision of the Israelis, of Ariel Sharon in particular, to evacuate Gaza was based on a very simple calculation that will remain all the way through, and it's the reason why Israel has been careful to call this the war against Hamas and not the war against Gazans, even if there is an overlap between support for Hamas and the Gazan population, is because the end of time and the end game, and the question we have to ask is there an end game, and does Israel have a strategy for the day after? The end game is to be that there are going to be people living in Gaza alongside Israel. Calculation of Ariel Sharon was that there was a demographic problem, that if Israel retained control of Gaza, they would retain control of 2 million people, joined with the Palestinian population in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, and joined with the Arab citizens of Israel. They would outnumber the Jews over time in the land between the sea and the river. And consequently, he thought that he could relieve Israel of 2 million Arabs, and that the people in Gaza would be wise enough to use their abilities to create something magnificent out of Gaza. And instead, Israel found itself having rockets in Gaza. And let's also say that there were major mistakes by the Israeli government, including the fact that the Israeli government felt that it could contain Hamas and live with Hamas. It approved the bribing of Hamas with money from Qatar. It approved the workers coming in from Gaza and was going to move from 18,000 to 36,000, figuring that its real enemy was the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority wanted to create, at least in its overture, wanted to create a Palestinian state, and that was anathema to the policies of this government of Israel. So they acquiesced with Hamas doing what Hamas did, ruling Gaza, because they felt that that could be contained. And what the events of October 7th showed to us is that they had deeply and profoundly miscalculated. So we're dealing in a novum. We're also dealing with something that I hate to say, but I'm by training someone who's committed to saying the truth, and it's a painful truth to say, that the most dangerous place for a Jew to be today, the most dangerous place, is Israel. I was in conversations with multiple Israelis yesterday, as every day, and what was intriguing is the number of Israelis that had to interrupt the conversation because rockets were being directed at them. So we have a very difficult, very painful situation, and we have a situation in which the basic assumptions of post-Holocaust Jewish life, that safety and security is to be in a Jewish state with a Jewish army, with a flag and a language, and that liberal democracy would be hospitable to the Jews, are being called into question. And that's the reason why Jews are feeling enormously disquieted today. And let me just add one more thing, and I'm speaking in the presence of Charles, who knows more about this than anybody else. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source, what type of anti-Semitism we have. Anti-Semitism differs as to its goal, what outcome the anti-Semite would like. Anti-Semitism differs as to its intensity. And the last is anti-Semitism differs as to the stability of society. And we're at a very difficult time in Jewish life and in human life at this moment in time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Berenbaum. It was truly an honor to have you with us today. And I know there are a couple of more questions, but we are short of time. So please direct your questions to me. My mail ID is there in the chat, and I will redirect it to Professor Berenbaum.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Professor. And we do
Very
have our
much.
next series in starting in 2 weeks from now, 27th of November, with Professor Joanna Silva.